B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comments. It's Thursday, October 15th, 2020. Well, our first October surprise was Trump being hospitalized and treated for COVID-19. And now it's the return of the laptop. Hey, CrowdStrike, you got this one? Huh? So the latest little political scandal that appears to be initiated by Rudy Giuliani, the president's good friend, was published yesterday in the New York Post, the tabloid owned by Rupert Murdoch. And the story is that Hunter Biden, or someone just like him, dropped off a MacBook Pro that had been soaked in water somehow at a computer repair shop in Delaware. Didn't pay for it and never came to pick it up. So the owner of this shop, who is described as legally blind, which could impair your ability to work on the micro details of a computer, well, the word is that he got curious. And since he had permission to open up the laptop to work on it, he accessed the hard drive. And the story continues that on the hard drive, he found a video. Maybe more than just one video. And it wasn't of Trump cavorting with hookers in Moscow who were told to give golden showers to a bed that the Obamas had slept in. No, the video reportedly is of Hunter Biden smoking crack while having sex with an unnamed partner. That's about all I know about the most lurid part of this. And in addition, on the laptop were emails and memos that, if they are true, would be heavily incriminating to Hunter Biden and his papa, Joey. So we have to treat this with, as I like to do on so many stories like this, deep skepticism. The chain of custody of the laptop alone is quite suspicious and suggests of deep political opportunism. And then we learned that on September 25th, Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, the Republican who has been running a committee that has been using information from murky figures in Ukraine, trying to run down the Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, Burisma story. And Joe Biden's threat to fire the Ukrainian prosecutor and cut off $1 billion in military aid to Ukraine if the government there didn't fire that prosecutor. I think his name is Viktor Shokin. And so in late September, and this parallels 2016, right? When it was in September that the FBI was examining Anthony Weiner's laptop and discovered, oh my God, his wife, Huma Abedin, who is a personal assistant to Hillary Clinton, had oodles of the Secretary of State's emails on that laptop, which was being examined by the FBI for Weiner's communications with an underage girl. And so, there are certain parallels here. We don't have too tall James Comey, FBI director, to come into the picture. And so far, we haven't heard anything about CrowdStrike being asked to go to the New York Post and examine this hard drive. So there are many questions here. But Ron Johnson sees this as solid evidence. Today's report, he said, raises more questions that must be resolved. There are so many red flags about the Biden family trying to cash in on the vice president's position that it can be hard to keep them straight. Now, Ron Johnson has to also keep a straight face. to overlook the deep and open corruption of the Trump family, with Ivanka and Crown Prince Jared serving in the administration while advancing their personal interests from an official perch, to the profiteering that goes all the way up to Trump himself, where people who spent money at Mar-a-Lago, at the Trump Hotel in Washington, at the golf clubs, got access and favors. But that doesn't matter, right? That doesn't matter because the only corruption that Republicans care about is by Democrats. So I examined the original report at the New York Post, and the documents that it shows could easily have been manufactured. The critical part is that Hunter Biden, if you believe these emails that have been published, arranged a meeting between the number 3 guy at Burisma and Vice President Joe Biden. And if that is true, and it is vigorously denied by the Biden campaign, they've looked at his schedule, say they never met with this guy. But if it's true, well, it makes Joe a big liar because he has publicly said, I have never spoken to my son about his overseas business dealings. Now, it's possible that that's narrowly true even if Joe Biden did meet with Burisma's number 3, because they could have used winks and nods without actually speaking about it, right? So this is a stinker. At the same time, I am prepared to follow the evidence, and if the New York Post can produce this hard drive, allow third parties to examine it, if the almost blind computer technician comes forward and tells a credible story, if the video matches and is actually Hunter Biden and not somebody else, these could be devastating to the Biden campaign. And, of course, that is the intention of the Trumpers who have delivered this. In addition to emails related to Ukraine and Burisma, the Post, in a follow-up story, is saying that there are emails that show how Hunter Biden pursued lucrative deals involving China's largest private energy company. And it details negotiations between Biden and partners in this venture, what their expectations were, how they were going to split up the loot. It essentially said that Hunter Biden was going to receive $850,000 a year and own 20% of the equity in the firm that they were setting up. And this is based on assertions that a man named Zhang Jianzhen, the former executive director of CEFC China, was on the other end of these communications. One email from August of 2017 involved a deal that he struck with the since-vanished chairman, Mr. Zhang, for half ownership of the holding company. Biden wrote that Yi had, if this is true, Biden wrote that Yi had sweetened the terms of an earlier 3-year consulting contract that was to pay him $10 million for, and that's a year, for introductions alone. So the firm being set up was called Hudson West. And I do believe that, Hunter Biden went on a trip to China with Joe. He made some contacts, and there was some discussion of creating business relationships. But there is enough of that is on the public record that a clever person working for Rudy Giuliani could easily concoct these kinds of emails that appear incriminating at this point. And I have to, without being equivocal here, I have to acknowledge that this could all be true. The documents could be real, and the effort by Hunter Biden to once again cash in on his surname because it's the same surname as the vice president at the time, well, that's consistent with his behavior over the years. And, of course, in Trump land, this stuff doesn't have to be true. It doesn't have to be 100% true. Anything that serves their purpose to undermine Joe Biden, and they would consider to be okay. And I still argue that Joe Biden has never appropriately offered regret or criticism of his sons cashing in on daddy's name and position. So I got a tweet this morning that said there was a great story at the Daily Beast about this, so I went to the Daily Beast website, and I immediately got this whiplash because the lead story in big, tabloid graphics is that the sage Rupert Murdoch has predicted that Biden is going to win. Now, this is the same sage who owns the New York Post and micromanages it to the degree that somewhere in my office I have a front page from the New York Post back in 2008 when Murdoch himself wrote the story that Dick Gephardt, the congressman from Iowa, and he'd been majority leader or speaker in the House, it's been a long time, anyway, that he was going to be the vice presidential pick of Barack Obama. So Murdoch is hardly an oracle. At any rate, the Daily Beast is not buying the New York Post report. It opens, quote, Rudy Giuliani's latest effort to push more dirt on the Bidens weeks before the election had some important backers, chief among them the president. In recent weeks, Trump was made aware of an alleged secret trove of material about Hunter Biden's foreign dealings and private life and was keen on getting it out into the public domain ASAP. Trump's been asking recently, have you heard about this hard drive? So yesterday, the Post began printing a series of stories supposedly based on the contents of a hard drive from a laptop computer that Hunter Biden allegedly left at a Wilmington, Delaware repair shop. Now, just to be fair here, the record will show that Hunter Biden once left a bundle of cocaine in a rental car. So he does seem to have a history of a certain absent-mindedness. So one of the sources who talked to the president about this said, the president knew that Rudy had something big coming on the Biden family. I remember hearing something about files and corruption, something about sex and drugs. It was evident the president was interested and wanted it done before the election. Giuliani's maintaining radio silence, says the Daily Beast. And then they start looking critically at what the Post has published. They say metadata on the PDF files purporting to show Hunter Biden's emails, published by the Post, suggests they were created on a Mac laptop on September 29 and October 10 of last year. Around the same time, the Giuliani's Ukrainian associates, Igor Fruman and Lev Parnas, remember them? Were arrested and charged with breaking campaign finance laws. The timing of the creation of those files, several months after Biden allegedly dropped off his laptop in April of 2019, raises questions about how and when Giuliani came into possession. So the chain of custody here is critical. And the Beast continues. Then there are questions around how the laptop allegedly found its way to the FBI. On Wednesday, A Daily Beast reporter tracked down John Paul Mac Isaac, a worker at a computer repair shop in Wilmington. Mac Isaac was nervous and quiet throughout a 1-hour interview. His account kept shifting. He wavered back and forth between saying he'd gone to the FBI with the materials and that the FBI had approached him. He wouldn't comment on whether he'd been in touch with Giuliani. And he said several times he was worried about his life, the lives of those close to him. And so for insurance, he made a copy of the computer's hard drive. And the beast continues. Both Twitter and Facebook took the aggressive step of blocking users from sharing the New York Post story. Now, I know that Facebook tried. They said they were going to throttle back its distribution. But last night, our listener and pal, John LaFrancois in Sacramento, he posted the New York Post story, and it arrived in my Facebook timeline, unflagged, untagged, and intact. And I don't spend enough time on Twitter to know whether anybody has managed to break through the blackout there. We'll comment on those efforts by social media in a minute or two here. So Ron Johnson at the Senate committee has acknowledged that he received materials related to the Post story on September 25th, the day after the publishing of his committee's Hunter Biden report. One more quote here from the Beast. Even if the Hunter Biden attacks don't manage to make a dent on his father's presidential campaign, Republicans were already hinting yesterday that they would continue hammering away at it after the election. 3 Trump advisors told the Daily Beast it was their hope that Hunter-related materials continue to haunt Biden post-November. And that, again, echoes 2016. And the Republicans appear to want to use a lame duck session, if you imagine that the Democrats regained control of the Senate in the November election, to pay back what they see as the criminal conspiracy that was used against Trump called Russiagate. And it really draws me to observe how petty so much of this is, and how these political maneuvers, attack and counterattack, are just so much childish neener. And this is interesting at BuzzFeed, which is a corporate media outlet aimed at younger people, filled with celebrity listicles and all that kind of crap. They say Facebook said Wednesday it would reduce the distribution of this New York Post story, pending a review of the site's by the site's fact-checking partners. But in paragraph 2, BuzzFeed goes for the kill. For more than a year, the social network has given a platform to a shady group of Ukrainian operatives, including one the U.S. Treasury sanctioned and deemed an active Russian agent, to spread unsubstantiated or debunked conspiracy theories about the Biden family. So, in the second paragraph, they tip the bias of this alleged neutral news story into a mode to defend the Bidens, and not even give a moment of thought, as I think I did in a hopefully fair manner here just a minute or two ago, that this stuff could be true. Back to BuzzFeed. These Ukrainians have been key to helping Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani in his efforts to smear the Bidens to help President Donald Trump win re-election. Along the way, they've garnered more than 200,000 followers and friends on Facebook, in part because of their popularity among supporters of the U.S. president, who look to them as sources of Biden-related allegations. And when the Post story was published, this group celebrated on Facebook by spreading unconfirmed information about the Bidens yet again. So they name names: Andriy Telizhenko, Alexander Onyshenko, and Andriy Derkach. Derkach is the former member of the Ukraine parliament who has been trying to spill so-called evidence. He's the one responsible for that heavily edited audio tape of a phone call between Biden and then Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko. And for example, they talk about how Telizhenko posted a link to a pro-Trump blog about a different New York Post story, but related to the Hunter Biden emails, and the posts were shared 5, 14, and 2 times with 36, 13, and 7 likes. I mean, that's nothing. That's just family and friends who saw that. So anyway, I find this interesting. And we turn now to the Washington Post fact-checker Glenn Kessler. And it's interesting because yesterday, the Post and the Times published nothing about the New York Post article. They are also circling the wagons to protect the Bidens. And of course, this is inconvenient. It diverts from the campaign, and even if it's 100% false, some people will believe it. So the defensive posture of the Biden campaign is understandable, but why are media outlets working defense on behalf of Joe Biden? So Kessler writes, the key thrust of the article is that an April 17, 2015 email suggests Hunter Biden arranged for a top executive at Burisma to meet with the then vice president while he was in charge of U.S. policy toward Ukraine. And this email, which I say does not look credible as I examined it online, it reads, Dear Hunter, thank you for inviting me to D.C. and giving an opportunity to meet your father and spent some time together. It's realty, an honor and pleasure. Now, is this an English person trying to create Russian, language and syntax errors? Kind of like those CIA assessments that were released to promote the Russiagate narrative. So then Kessler asks, how do we know the email is authentic? We do not, he says. The Post published PDF printouts of several emails allegedly taken from the laptop, but for the smoking gun email, it shows only a photo made the day before the story was posted. There's no header information, no metadata, says an expert they sought to comment on this. The Post has not been able to independently verify or authenticate these emails. And Giuliani is not talking. They note there's also no indication that Hunter Biden replied to that email. And the Biden campaign trots out Michael Carpenter. I was with the vice president in all of his meetings on Ukraine. We never met with this guy. In fact, I had never heard of this guy until the New York Post story broke. And the Post article also cites an email from Pozhikarsky, that's the number 3 guy at Burisma, to Hunter Biden, saying he was going to share this information with the U.S. Embassy here in Kyiv, as well as the office of Mr. Amos Hochstein in the States. So with Biden as a special envoy, he said, I know for a fact he never contacted me or my office. I provided every record to the Senate investigation. No mention of this guy was ever made. No emails, no correspondence. I know almost every player in the energy sector in Ukraine. I never met this guy. Hunter Biden, through an attorney, told the Washington Post, we have no idea where this came from and certainly cannot credit anything that Rudy Giuliani provided to the New York Post. But what I do know for certain is that this purported meeting never happened. Okay, what about the video? I mean, I don't really want to watch it. I'd like to see if it's verified. At least that would prove that the laptop in question came from Hunter Biden. So Mac Isaac, the computer repair guy from Delaware, told reporters Wednesday that a MacBook laptop was dropped off at his shop in Wilmington, April 2019. He said he's legally blind and that he was almost certain that it was Hunter Biden who dropped it off. He said that he made several attempts to get in touch with Biden, but the equipment was still in his hands 90 days after it had been left there. He said that he became curious about what he had seen, so he made a copy of the hard drive and gave it to Giuliani. Now, of all the people in the country, you decide to give this material to, why would you pick America's mayor of 9/11? So the story is quite flaky. Again, I reserve room for any evidence that proves that these claims are true. So now to the effort to block out or censor these reports. And I think it's ludicrous and insulting that Facebook and Twitter immediately took the position to block access to the New York Post. I mean, tens of thousands. I don't know what the circulation of the Post is anymore in New York, and during the pandemic, it may have low readership because there aren't as many people on the subway. But who are you kidding that you think you can suppress a story like this published in a major urban daily tabloid? And on what basis do you determine that these charges are true or false? And this gets into the same arguments that I raised with Brad Friedman in our recent in-depth interview here at peterbcollins.com about the arbitrary nature of the standards of both Facebook and Twitter. And this is the most extreme action that Twitter has taken that involves President Trump. They've given him such leeway. And so their immediate and aggressive action yesterday deserves further exploration. And they have taken down the account of the White House liar-in-chief, press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, because she retweeted the New York Post article. Now, again, the idea that they immediately knew that this had to be blocked. They took action to do so. They claimed that, Twitter's standards of election interference were offended, and also an image in the Post's article contained email addresses and phone numbers as well as hacked materials that violate Twitter's rules for posting. But we know those rules are really flexible. Yep, just like the ropes in a boxing ring. You can pull them apart, move a body through them. Hours after the Post published its story, Facebook said it would reduce the article's distribution on its platform until it was subject to fact-checking. And this is an open admission that they censor material. And I've raised this issue before. Forgive me if it's repetitive, like Rachel Maddow's opening stories every night. But Facebook dances around the issue of whether it's a publisher or not. And if it were not a publisher, as it claims, it would not be selectively censoring or throttling back distribution of certain reports. YouTube likewise says it's not a publisher, but it's hardening its ban on QAnon. They announced that it's updating its hate speech and harassment policies to prohibit content that targets an individual, conspiracy theories that have been used to justify real-world violence. Again, I am no sympathizer with QAnon, but I believe the people who promote and consume the crackpot ideas of QAnon, short of evoking violence or advocating it, that you really can't just single out individual sources ban them or reduce their visibility, and then claim you're not a publisher. Those positions are incongruent. And in the article reporting this about YouTube, the New York Times says the platform has tried for years to curb the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories and tweaked the recommendations algorithm that was sending millions of viewers to what it considered low-quality content. In 2019, the company began to demote what it called content. Those are editorial decisions. And these companies have to pick a side here. If you're not a publisher, you should not be filtering, censoring, or throttling back information that is legal that people post, even if it's wrong. And I know there are a lot of people who think I'm extreme about freedom of expression. Many people are willing to rationalize in the current climate. They believe Trump is evil and that efforts to filter, throttle back, or censor information that he promulgates is appropriate. And I used to argue more forcefully that the American people are smart and they can decide for themselves. But the continuing unfettered support for Trump by his cult, it makes that a very difficult argument to muster these days. I hope you feel sorry for me, if only a little. All right, so interesting counter. What do we want to call this? The counter launch of a narrative. And it comes from a man I respect, Lee Fung, and a fairly new reporter at The Intercept named Mara Hvistendahl. Hvistendahl. And they dug into the affairs of a guy named Eric Branstad. You're saying, who the F is that? Well, he is similar to Hunter Biden. He is the son of a prominent Republican politician, Terry Branstad, who has served a long stretch, a total of 5, maybe even 6 terms as the governor of Iowa. He most recently left that job in 2017 when Trump appointed Terry Branstad as the U.S. ambassador to China. And we learn in this lengthy investigation by Fung and Hvistendahl that young Eric Branstad worked at a lobby shop called Mercury Public Affairs. They got the account of ZTE, a Chinese company that Trump had threatened to ban from commerce in the United States. And after suspending ZTE under a Commerce Department order, that order was withdrawn after the Mercury Public Affairs lobby team, which, according to this report, included Eric Branstad, sprung into action. Branstad was not properly registered as a lobbyist for ZTE or China. And it's clear that he was able to gain access and peddle influence because of who his father is. Now, Eric Branstad told The Intercept he's not lobbied the Commerce Department in any way. Oh, I forgot to mention, he spent some time working over at Commerce and then used the revolving door to go to Mercury Public Affairs. And Eric said, I didn't even know about ZTE until it was over. I was not part of that account. But emails and Commerce Department calendars obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, and that's what Lee Fung is really good at, suggests that Eric Branstad worked on and off with a guy named Lanza, who was at Mercury, after they had met on the Trump campaign in 2016. So this is a fascinating backfire, if you will. We use fire analogies here because California is still burning, not as bad as it was, but there's still some fires burning in wilderness areas here. So I've linked to this Intercept report. I encourage you to take a look. If anything, it shows that nepotism and that trading on the name of a parent who has political influence is pretty common. Well, you won't be surprised. Tonight, in the wake of the presidential debate that was canceled because Trump didn't want to do it virtually, both candidates will be featured in town halls. Joe Biden is going to do it with ABC, and Donald Trump has been invited by NBC News. And at MSNBC, Chris Hayes was pissed last night because his show was preempted so that they could put Trump on MSNBC. Now, there is a lot of chattering and criticism going on about this. Here's a former NBC News executive, Cheryl Gould. I am dismayed, more like disgusted, by NBC's decision to air Trump's "I won't play by the rules, so let me make my own rules" town hall opposite Biden's. Now, I understand some of the criticisms. They're going to be on opposite each other. In a few days, we'll have ratings information, and Trump will be able to say, "I had more viewers than Biden." Or maybe not, but that's what he hopes. And that kind of numbers-based one-upsmanship is really important to Trump. But I actually think it's good for MSNBC viewers to take a break from all the opposition research about Trump, which is the mainstay of their reporting, and observe this guy in action. He'll be touting his immune status from COVID after his Jesus-like death and resurrection at Walter Reed over a single weekend. But there are other issues at play. NBC really couldn't turn Trump down because of equal time requirements, and they did a town hall with Joe Biden last week at 8 p.m. on Thursday. And so in many respects, NBC is observing the letter of the law, the equal time provisions of the 1934 Communications Act. And there are other people who just, blow past those technicalities and say, look, you are rewarding Trump for refusing to participate in a one-on-one debate. And there is some merit to that argument. But in the end, I don't think it means all that much. Well, Trump is continuing his attacks on Biden. Yesterday was the Photoshop of Biden in an old folks' home in a wheelchair. Today, he launched attacks, speaking to the Fox Business Network, calling Biden mentally shot, a liar, and a corrupt politician. And, of course, it was on Fox, so nobody said, "I know you are, but what is he?" Also, The Intercept features a report on one of Trump's this week, mob rallies in Iowa. And Aaron Calvin is the correspondent on the scene in the Hawkeye State. And Trump misstated that Iowa had flooded, when in fact, in August, it was subject to this bizarre windstorm called the derecho. And he notes that Trump drew a crowd of only 1,000 people, a majority of whom remained unmasked. And some pro-Biden group had bought a billboard near the airport with a big red arrow pointing toward the airport saying, "This way to the super spreader event." And maybe that's what caused the attendance to drop. I should also note that the Harris and Biden campaign has not been breaking any records at crowds where they appear, even in proper socially distanced settings. And this article notes that Trump is facing a cash crunch. They've canceled their TV and radio ads in Iowa. That Trump bragged about all the cash that he has shoveled into Iowa to try to compensate for his failed trade war with China. The polling in Iowa is problematic for Trump. Its COVID cases are rising. 2 days before Trump's arrival in Iowa, saw new records for COVID-related hospitalizations. So that's a little bit of a snapshot. Without sickening you by playing a Trump soundbite from a rally. More information showing that Democrats are trending toward taking back the Senate. This coming from the LA Times today, and they note in Arizona, Martha McSally is trailing Mark Kelly, the Democrat former astronaut, by 10 points. In Colorado, it's an 11-point gap between Cory Gardner, the embattled Republican incumbent, and the former conservative Democrat governor, John Hickenlooper. 2 seats up in Georgia. The race against incumbent David Perdue. Is that the right Perdue? Yeah, David. Sorry. John Ossoff, who lost in a race for Congress, is ahead of Perdue by 1 point. That's well within the margin of error. But in the other race, where 2 Republicans, Doug Collins and Kelly Loeffler, are fighting to get into a runoff, the Democrat, Reverend Raphael Warnock, has 41%. So there is a possibility of a Senate pickup in Georgia. Iowa, where we were just talking about Trump's visit, shows that the pig farmer, Joni Ernst, the Republican incumbent, is polling 5 points behind her so-called progressive challenger, Teresa Greenfield. In Maine, Susan Collins is about 5 points down from her Democratic opponent, Sarah Gideon. In Montana, Steve Daines has an uptick in his polling. It had been shown as a tie, but Daines now is showing a 9-point lead over the Democratic governor, Steve Bullock. North Carolina, despite his texting, Cal Cunningham, the Democrat, maintains a lead 48 to 42% over Tom Tillis. It's widely expected that Doug Jones, the sometime Democrat in Alabama, is going to lose to the former coach at at Auburn, Tommy, I guess they say Tuberville. I'm not a football fan, so I wouldn't know that. And in Michigan, Gary Peters, the Democratic incumbent, is in a virtual tie with his challenger, Republican John James. The other race that people have been watching, hopeful, is Lindsey Graham's effort to hold on to his seat under a blistering assault from Jamie Harrison, who has $50 million in the bank. Well, the latest polling is discouraging, and maybe it's a bounce coming from the Supreme Court confirmation hearings. But Lindsey Graham is showing a 6-point lead over Jamie Harrison in a New York Times Siena poll. It only had 605 respondents, which is a little low. But other polling matches that. Data for Progress. Morning Consult gives Lindsey a 6-point lead. Quinnipiac shows them tied. And Lindsey Graham is still a little desperate because in the halls of the Senate today, he was being interviewed on C-SPAN, and he said, I think people in South Carolina are excited about Judge Barrett. I don't know how much it affected fundraising today, but if you want to help me close the gap, I think the contest in South Carolina has taken on a sort of national profile. That kind of pitch on federal property is against the law, Senator. Joe Biden's fundraising, reporting a fresh $383 million in September, entering October with over $400 million cash on hand. He's raised nearly $750 million since August 1st. Democrats trying to bet on change. Oh, and in Iowa, another voter suppression scheme. 70,000 absentee ballot applications have been invalidated, and that's been upheld by the Iowa Supreme Court. The ruling upheld a contentious directive by the Secretary of State, a Republican named Paul Pate, that required the applications to be blank when they were sent out to voters, but in 3 counties, the election officials ignored that and pre-filled the forms to make it easier for voters. They'll do anything to keep people from voting. The Massachusetts governor, Republican Charlie Baker, is not coming out and saying he'll vote for Biden. But when asked if he would be voting for Trump, he said, I think I may take a pass on that one. And back in 2016, I was in Ohio for my mom's funeral, the weekend before Election Day, when early voting was underway. And then Secretary of State, Republican John Husted, had issued this ugly order saying that early voting could only occur at 1 precinct per county. Well, his successor, Republican Frank LaRose, pulled out that same playbook. And now there are long lines in Democratic strongholds like Cleveland and Columbus. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Well, today, the embattled president of Kyrgyzstan, Suranbay Jeenbekov, or is it Jeenbekov, announced his resignation after 2 weeks of protests left 1 person dead and 1,000 injured. He said, "For me, peace in Kyrgyzstan, the country's integrity, the unity of our people, and calm in society are more important than anything else. Military personnel and law enforcement agencies are obliged to use weapons to protect the residents of the head of state. In this case, blood will be shed. It is inevitable. I urge both sides not to succumb to provocations." And he said, "I am not clinging to power. I don't want to go down in the history of Kyrgyzstan as a president who allowed bloodshed and shooting on its people. I have taken the decision to resign." And today I'm releasing a fresh in-depth interview where I pursue some of my own questions about the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And listener John Zwiebel about a week ago said, "Peter, you haven't mentioned it, and it's looking like a pretty hot conflict." The reason I didn't mention it, and I tell you this in the interview podcast, is that I didn't have enough knowledge to make any comments that might be considered even remotely intelligent. So I turned to my friend, Terry Phillips, a longtime network radio reporter. He has covered Armenia and Azerbaijan in the past. He is of Greek and Armenian heritage. He knows that region very well. And he gave me an education that I'm sharing with you. I think you'll find it quite edifying. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with journalist Terry Phillips.
Right. Some people refer to this as a religious war, which is not accurate. I mean, there are differences of religion between the peoples of those two countries, but it's not about that. It's about territory and claims of territory that go back, as I mentioned, a long, long time. The people who lived in that area were intermixed. There were Armenians living in Azerbaijan and Azeri people living in Armenia. But as the Soviet Union collapsed, people tended to retreat to their ethnic homelands. And yet there were some remnants of population in those places. Armenia today, the Republic of Armenia, is almost entirely devoid of Azeri people. And similarly in Azerbaijan, most of the Armenians have left there. There were pogroms in Azerbaijan. There were acts of violence against Azeri people in Armenia. It was a really messy period as the Soviet Union was collapsing. And I should mention one other important historical event, which was a terrible earthquake in Armenia in 1988. And it took tens of thousands of lives and made somewhere in the hundreds of thousands homeless. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to Armenia after that earthquake to express his condolences and to show his support for the people in Armenia, he was shocked that Armenian people were not asking for help for the earthquake survivors. They were asking for help in resolving the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh. He couldn't believe that that's what they cared most about. But it was the issue and remains the issue for Armenians.
You can hear the full interview with Terry Phillips. It's available for subscribers later today at iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher, and always at peterbcollins.com. And today, instead of mentioning people who are contributors to the podcast, I want to thank the international listeners. So first up, I got some English free verse, and it's been a while, from our friend Jens Ivan Nielsen in the island of Bornholm in Denmark. And he wrote this, and I'll just read it to you. Yes, I am alive, still, but I am from an island, Bornholm, in Denmark, a small island in a larger world. And what to say? I am afraid I have hope. We are the people. Thank you, Peter B. And then he says, P.S. Please do come to my little island, Bornholm. All right, I'm putting it on my bucket list, Jens, and as I head into retirement after the American election is resolved, I'll put Denmark and Bornholm on my list and see when you'll permit me to enter your country. But I also want to thank a listener in the Netherlands, in Den Haag, George Mashke, and also another listener in Ukraine, Emir. Emir took to Twitter, and Mashke, I can't remember where I saw his comment. Maybe it was in a direct email to me. In any event, they correctly noted that I misspelled the word impunity in the headline of yesterday's podcast. It's been corrected, but probably that correction will not ripple through if you've already downloaded the podcast, and my apologies for misspelling that. I want to recommend to you a report by Ben Norton over at the Gray Zone Project, together with its founder, Max Blumenthal, his wife, Anya Parampil. They are the posse in Bolivia who got an invitation to become independent international observers of the October 18th election. The Gray Zone has been one of the few outlets that's covered the coup that brought to power the right-wing Catholic administration of President Janine Áñez. After the administration of Hugo Morales, there has been a real crackdown. And they are hoping that this election will cement the power of those who brought the coup on, with, of course, the support of the United States. And so as they flew to Bolivia, they were changing planes in Chile, and they noticed a number of people were taking their pictures. Those pictures showed up on social media in Bolivia before they even set foot on Bolivian soil. They're already being disparaged as, Maduro sympathizers. They're being slammed as people who are enemies of the state. Max Blumenthal is smeared as a disinformation expert from RT, the Russian media outlet. Bolivian extremists also smeared Blumenthal as a terrorist, a propagandist who came to burn the entire country. Welcome to Bolivia, Gray Zone. Looking forward to your reports. So the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett is a done deal. There were some light skirmishes, a feeble attempt by the Democrats to hold off on any further proceedings until after the election. They were steamrolled by the Republican majority. And, I appreciate they made the attempt, but it's clear they really weren't committed to disrupting this process. So it's really on track. The Republicans announced that the committee vote will be a week from today, and that the full vote in the Senate, deliberations will begin, I believe, on October 23rd. So she will be installed on the court and be able to proceed, or not preside, but to be a participant in any post-election appeals brought by the Trump administration. And I do want to note today was just kind of a pro forma where witnesses for and against the nominee testified. And I'm glad that the Democrats trotted out Crystal Good of West Virginia, because she was very blunt and direct. She told her story that she got pregnant at age 16. Her parents, she knew, would not approve of her choice of an abortion, so she went through the process of getting a judge to grant her permission in place of her parents. And the judge did that. After she told him, "Your Honor, I have a future. I want an abortion." She closed by saying, "Please listen to people who have abortions. Hear us when we ask you. Do not confirm this nominee. Our futures, families, and lives depend on it." And the LA Times has a good analytical piece noting that Republicans responded to the Democratic emphasis that Judge Barrett will participate in destroying Obamacare with an orchestrated response from Mitch McConnell. Quote, "No one believes the Supreme Court is going to strike down the Affordable Care Act." Senator John Kennedy, Republican of Louisiana, called the idea that Barrett would support a ruling eliminating the health care law preposterous. "Put down the bong," he said. "Americans don't believe that. My Democratic colleagues think Americans are morons." And the chorus continues with people like Chuck Grassley, Ted Cruz. I don't believe them for a minute. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, we have 1,093,000 deaths reported. In the United States, 217,000 deaths. There were variously 750 to 1,000 new deaths reported yesterday, depending on which source you use. And the New York Times exposes how back on February 24th was when Trump declared on Twitter that the coronavirus was very much under control. He even added an observation, "Stock market starting to look very good to me." But hours earlier, the president's senior economic team were privately addressing board members of the Hoover Institution, the right-wing ivory tower here at Stanford. Then key board members, many of them Republican donors, got another taste of government uncertainty from Larry Kudlow. And a memo written by a hedge fund consultant who attended this gathering of Hoover's board wrote, "What struck me as a point of concern," he says, "what struck me was that nearly every official he heard from raised the virus as a point of concern totally unprovoked." So the word spread through the investor communities. He described Hoover briefings in a lengthy email he wrote to, this is William Callahan, by the way, Callanan, my apologies. He's a hedge fund veteran and a member of the board at Hoover. So he wrote to David Tepper, founder of the hedge fund Appaloosa Management, and one of his senior lieutenants. Those investors in turn passed the information to their own contacts, ultimately delivering aspects of the readout to at least 7 investors at 4 money management firms across the country. And the next day, stock markets had dropped more than 300 points. So that's insider trading. No problem. It's the Trump administration. And Politico has done a review of which states had the best response to the pandemic. And they place Vermont at the top, quoting Fauci that this should be the model for the country. Vermont reopened very gradually. Local governments have the authority to set stricter rules. Visitors from places with higher infection rates are required to quarantine for 2 weeks. There's a statewide mask requirement, and they had an early commitment to testing and contact tracing. They cite Seattle as an example of a large urban center that mounted an effective defense against the virus, employing rapid coordination and an early focus on vulnerable populations. Michigan stood out as a leader in closing racial disparities. In mid-April, Michigan created a task force to address disparities, making it one of just a dozen similar health equity task forces across the country. Colorado, Idaho, Minnesota, Massachusetts, and Connecticut were recognized for their efforts in managing economic fallout. For excellence in opening schools, Rhode Island and Florida. Really? Oh, they're saying the state excelled in its preparations for remote instruction thanks to frequent hurricanes. Okay. And the narrative at the New York Times today says the number of new coronavirus cases in the U.S. is surging once again after growth slowed in late summer. And they have a fascinating animated graphic on the home page at the Times, which shows, going back to February, where the cases congregated. And we see that still to this day, it is the South and the Midwest that are hardest hit, with the Dakotas, North and South, at the top of the list of daily new reported cases. And as of October 13, we're back up to an average of 52,000 cases per day. The peak in July was 67,000 per day. The peak back in April was a mere 31,000. So cases are going up. Hospitalization rates in certain areas are going up. And to my knowledge, we are not seeing a big increase in fatalities. It's pretty steady, averaging between 700 and 1,000 per day nationwide. Portland, and that's Portland, Oregon, and the city of Oakland, California, just across the bay from me, are partners in a new lawsuit against the U.S. Homeland Security and Justice Departments, alleging that both have engaged in unconstitutional overreach by sending in or threatening to use federal forces to quell social justice protests. I applaud this lawsuit. We need this clarified. The lawsuit says that dispatching federal officers either secretly or with little warning to Portland and deploying federal officers to non-federal property with virtually limitless jurisdiction, plus erecting a fence around the Hatfield Courthouse in Portland without a permit. These are cited as overreaches by the federal government. And Oakland joined the suit to thwart the possibility that the feds would deputize its police officers. That's something that happened in Portland to the regret of the city attorney, who is trying to get the deputizations canceled. The lawsuit claims the federal practices mark a monumental policy change that harms the city's abilities to safely govern and have stirred further unrest. Remember Ammon Bundy? He's the cowboy who took control of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in a protest a couple of years ago in eastern Oregon. And before that, Ammon teamed up with his daddy, Cliven Bundy, back in 2014 to protest grazing fees on their property, the ranch in Nevada. Well, Ammon says that he has now recruited more than 20,000 members across the country to what he calls the People's Rights Network. And this is based on a report from the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights. This new network, which the report refers to as Ammon's Army, includes militia members, anti-maskers, conspiracy theorists, preppers, anti-vaccination activists. Its rapid growth has been boosted by the joining of Bundy's far-right paramilitary supporters cultivated from the armed standoffs over the years, with a large base of new activists radicalized through protests over COVID-19 restrictions. He claims to have 153 assistants in 16 states, including Oregon, Arkansas, California, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Kentucky, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, North Dakota, Pennsylvania, Texas, Utah, and Washington. And the president of the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights is Devin Burghardt. He said, since the early days of the pandemic, we've documented the division and violence sown by Ammon Bundy and his far-right followers in the Northwest. Bundy told a crowd that if local, state, or federal officials attempt to enforce laws the group doesn't like, that people's rights is prepared to adopt a violent posture. And Devin Burghardt also says that the leaders of this movement actually want governmental power to be used to protect the righteous against what they call wicked liberals. Yeah, it's libtards like us who are the problem in this country. Isn't it good to know how dangerous we truly are? Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You can share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.